Yeah, I tried to move it. Hold on. Hopefully it's okay. Hello, how's everyone doing today? It's Daniel Rothschild. I'm here with special guest Dan Ariely. Dan Ariely is a behavioral economist. He teaches at Duke University. He's the author of such books as Predictably Irrational, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, and The Upside of Irrationality. How are you doing today?
I am very well. I actually had a long flight last night. I arrived this morning back in the US from South America, but I'm surprisingly awake.
All right, very nice. All right, hopefully we'll have a very interesting interview. I guess my first question is, I guess a three-part question. One is, what is the difference between behavioral economics and, I guess, regular economics? And why do you think...
Why don't we do one at a time?
Sure. So I guess what's the difference between behavioral econ and regular econ?
Okay. So, there's lots of flavors of economics, but the standard rational economics is a perspective that assumes lots of things from people, right? So it assumes axioms that people basically know their preferences, they always make the right decision, they have no emotion, that can have no computational limitation. And behavioral economics, on the other hand, doesn't make any assumptions, right? So for example, if you see people smoking, in standard economics, you don't say they make mistakes because people can never make mistakes. You just ask the question of why do people smoke? And you might come and say, oh, it's so much pleasure to smoke, and smoking is just such joyful activity that it's worth it, right? There's never the notion that a mistake would happen. In behavioral economics, we don't assume anything about people. We just put people in different situations and we see how they behave. So in the case of smoking, yes, we see that people smoking, but when people die from cancer, we also see that they really regret smoking. So we say, there's something inconsistent here. People, yes, they smoked, it was pleasurable, but they did not understand everything and they made a mistake. And the other important thing to understand about economics is that economics is both a descriptive study, and a prescriptive study, right? And no other social science is prescriptive. So descriptive means that we just describe human behavior and we have a model that explains some of human behavior. But the prescriptive part is where economists tell the rest of us how to run our lives, right? So economists say, here's how you design a taxation system, and here's how you design hospital and education system and so on, because this is the recipe for a good life. And the problem that I have with economics is with the prescriptive part, right? So imagine you have a theory for bridges, and your theory was correct 25% of the time. That's very nice for theory, but it's not good for when you're going to try and build a bridge, right? And I think economics is like that economics has lots of beauty and lots of insights and lots of important lessons, but it doesn't capture all of our understanding of human beings. And when we come to design a healthcare system, educational system, you name it, we need a more comprehensive understanding of human beings in order to design something better. So those are the two big differences. It's the assumption part and it's the prescriptive part.
Okay, cool. So I'm getting my PhD currently in Econ, and so I just want to respond to some of the things you said. There's a lot, there are obviously different schools of economic thought, and I think the one you're criticizing mainly is the neoclassical, it seems. And, there are parts of that I disagree on. So first of all, you said that economics assumes perfect information. But
I didn't say perfect information. I said that people know everything about their preferences, and They have perfect computational powers.
Oh, sorry, you said they don't make mistakes, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, but if economics assumes that people don't make mistakes, then how would they explain profit and loss? Because if people don't make mistakes, no one would ever go bankrupt, right? No,
that's right. So first of all, there's randomness. Everybody recognizes randomness, and there's also lack of information, right? So if there was something that you didn't know in advance, of course, nobody assumes that everybody knows everything. But whatever you know, you're making perfect assumptions. You're making perfect computations based on that, right? That's the notion. Now, let me say one more thing about kind of economics. And of course, everybody who has a PhD in economics understand that these are just assumptions. There are a few people who say, oh, we're just making these assumptions and they're simplifying assumptions. And, we know that they're not true. But in order for economics to work, and in order for the theory to work, and for this elegant theory to, we have to make these assumptions, but we know that these assumptions are not true. Well, I will challenge you to open any introductory text to economics and come out with the view that these are just simplifying assumptions. At a certain level, economists, and I hope you're not going to be one of them, are playing a double game. On one hand, the sophisticated PhD students or PhDs in economics are saying, yes, we know these are just simplifying assumptions. But on the other hand, when they sell economics to the public, when they sell it in terms of policy, when they teach economics in introductory textbooks, in introductory classes, they're selling it as a very, very different theory. So, I am not doubting that most economists basically know that these are simplifying assumptions and that the world is not as simple, but it's not what economists do. So economists preach and do a very simplified theory, even if they know truthfully that this is not the right theory. And I think that's another kind of interesting component, where it's easy to peddle a simplified theory. So, you studied, how many years ago did you take introductory to economics as an undergrad?
Well, my BA is in English, but my master's maybe 3 years ago.
Okay, so when you took the introductory class, was every chapter, every class basically saying these are assumptions that we know are not true, but let's just make them for the heck of it because it's interesting and it helps us move forward? Or did people at some point forget that these are just simplified assumptions and behaved as if they were the real thing?
Right. So, look, there are, there are simplifying assumptions that I think some economists make that are wrong, right? So, for instance, there are certain people who say, I think, Gary Becker and Stiegler wrote a paper, that preferences are stable. And, the example I like to give is, then why does anyone get divorced? Obviously, preferences aren't stable. But I don't think you need to assume that, right? Yeah. I think good economists understand that if you're starving, your preferences for steak is much different than
you didn't just say that Gary Becker was not a good economist.
Well, okay, maybe I'll say that once I get tenure. But fine. I think there's
I think it is a really interesting game. Look, economics gets lots of leverage from assumptions, because assumptions do restrict the solution space and they provide lots of interesting ideas. But there are things that we play with models. And I think that the Becker models, as much as I disagree with them, I think they're very interesting thought experiments, right? So as a discipline that is kind of about thought process and exploring human nature and so on, I have no qualms about philosophers making some assumptions that I don't think are reasonable. I don't mind economists making some assumptions, because, there are some places that preferences are probably stable. Like our appreciation of beauty seems to be quite stable. And so I don't think that the assumption that the heroic assumption that economists make are outside of the realm of science, outside of the realm of academic economics. The problem is, what happens when you make these assumptions and then you decide, and now I think I know enough to run a school, or to tell people how to create a taxation system in Iceland, or to run a bank, right? So let me ask you a question.
Go ahead.
How suited do you think are people who graduate with a PhD in economics to truly tell us how to lead our life? Right, to be the advisory council to the president, and to create, to tell companies how to run things, to be in think tanks, to basically redirect the country from that perspective.
Right. Well, I don't think that's so my view is that economics economics is prescriptive and it's not descriptive at all. Sorry, it's descriptive, it's not prescriptive at all. So, I sort of agree with Hayek, who said economics tells us, shows us the limits of our knowledge, and what we imagine we can design, and shows the failings of that. So I think there is, I think it's sort of this maybe a hubris to believe that an economist knows that what's good for millions of people.
Yeah, but this hubris is part of reality. It's kind of that's kind of an interesting discussion. And this flavor I've had with lots of economists, with lots of very good economists, basically say, we know that we have no business running anything in the world. Right. So you talk to Ariely, for example, and you talk to some very good game theorists, and they say, don't confuse me with knowing anything about the real world. I know game theory quite well, but it has nothing to do with the world. It's a game that we play. It's a thought experiment, and we're studying this thought experiment very well. But let's not. I'm not willing to fool myself that I can give any practical advice. And when I give practical advice, it's not from economics. It's from just being a thoughtful person in general. And so I think that that's true. And of course, lots of economists are very smart individuals, and they can give you good advice because they're smart, not necessarily because they studied economics. But it's very easy. I think you're finding kind of the easy way out by saying, I believe it's descriptive and not prescriptive. Because the reason economists get so many undergrads and so many jobs and so many think tanks and so on is because as a profession, economics is claiming that there's a real practical use for economics, right? If you basically got all economists to start saying out loud that economics has no value outside of the economic department in the university, how many undergrads would flock to your classes?
Well, I'm not saying it has no value. I'm not saying it has no value, right?
But let's say no more value as a descriptive theory than anthropology.
Okay.
Right, because anthropology is too a descriptive perspective on life that is quite useful.
Right.
Right. Economics became so powerful in terms of being the social science of choice. It became so powerful in terms of having so many undergrads and so much impact on the world, because of the prescriptive side. So right. To say, oh yes, there's no prescriptive side, it's again, it's kind of playing the game on both sides. It's enjoying the fact that economics is claiming a lot of prescriptive things, but saying, but I'm not part of that game.
Well, so maybe I should clarify. Economics as such is non-normative, value-free, prescriptive. Economists themselves are prescriptive. Economics is descriptive. So I, as an economist with a certain value system, and my knowledge of economics may say, okay, based on artificially increasing the money supply lowers the purchasing power. So I'm gonna maybe try to tell people to not engage in quantitative easing or whatever. So I might do that as an economist, but economics itself, just like I think physics doesn't tell people whether to jump off a roof or not, physicists who value life might tell people don't jump off a roof, or at least not without a parachute.
Yeah, so I don't think that, I think it's a nice perspective, but I don't think it's exactly a fair representation of the field, because the field as a whole is doing that a lot, right? So if we have a group of people, you say, oh, let's not confuse economics and economists. It's right. Kind of like the argument, let's not confuse Islam and Muslims. And of course, not all, there's lots of differences between Islam and Muslims. There's lots of differences between economists and economics. But if you have something that lots of economists do, I don't think you want to say, and this is not economics. Economics is the field as it is practiced. It is kind of unfair to say that when these people go and tell us how to run our lives, I'm thinking about the No Child Left Behind policy, or Obamacare. When you say those people tell us how to run their life, they're doing it with the profession of economics and the discipline behind them, basically claiming that as the reason for doing it. They're not saying, I am Joe and this is what I think you should do.
Okay.
So I think you're right that in the sense that it doesn't have to be like this, but it just happened that this is how things are.
Okay, so let's talk and give a few examples. So, for instance, I would say that. I guess my first question to you is for example, in your book, Predictably Irrational, you say one of the assumptions, I guess, the neoclassical school economists make is that people are rational, and they're not, and because of that, that's loaded with some errors. So I guess my first question is, what is the definition of rationality?
Yeah, but by the way, just to be clear, there's of course lots of types of economists, right? There are econometricians, there are people who do experiments. So it is true that we're talking about kind of a very basic notion of economics. We're kind of talking about the economics 101 kind of version of the rational model. And there's lots of versions of how to define rationality. Philosophers have a different version at Economist and so on. There are two versions that I care about. The first version that I care about is kind of the standard economic definition, right? In standard rational economics, people have complete and transitive preferences, right? And we can take that as two building blocks and do a lot from that. And if people have complete and transitive preferences, there's lots of things you can make from it. But I think that the results show quite strongly that doesn't hold. So that's one kind of definition, and I care about that because, again, the policy implication. Like, if economists basically why don't we attack historians, or why don't we attack sociologists, right? It's because I look at the world, and for example, one of the things that I look at is dishonesty. I've done lots of studies on dishonesty, and with the economic notion that people make intertemporal trade-off and calculated choices between preferences, we have things like the death penalty, right? The death penalty is based on the idea that there's a big punishment, and people would take that big punishment into account, and they will say, let me not commit a crime. So you come home late at night, you're pissed off with your significant other, you go to the kitchen, you pull a big knife, and you say, oh, we have the death penalty in this state, let's do something else instead. The reality is that when we look at the death penalty, the states that have the death penalty and the states that don't have the death penalty don't have different crime rates for the crime rates that could get you the death penalty. Mm-hmm. Or you look at the 3 strikes and you're out in California, right? There was this notion of saying, let's make the third crime so expensive, life in prison, that nobody would ever commit that. Right? And we tried that, and it just didn't work. So the idea that people have complete intransitive preferences and they make calculated decisions about those, I think is not always true, and it's not true in cases that are incredibly damaging for society. So if people just theorize it in their offices, I don't mind, because there's some things that, of course, are like that. But when we come to build policies around that, and we do the death penalty, for example, that bothers me. So that's one thing. By the way, talking about dishonesty, another thing that bothers me is that in economics, there is not the notion of wishful blindness, right? Because you kind of know your preferences and you make action based on those. There's no wishful blindness, so there's no conflicts of interest. Right, so you're a broker, you're a trader. 2006, you see things correctly, or whatever you see it, but you're not blinded by your conflicts of interest. Whereas, in fact, I think there's lots of evidence that people are blinded by conflicts of interest. So if you think about the regulations we did after 2007, 2008, they were all designed to deal with psychopaths. They were designed to deal with people who said, what's the cost? What's the benefit? When do I get more? When do I get less? And to basically try to get people to act in a way that is better for their clients. But the regulation did not deal with conflicts of interest, because conflicts of interest is just not part. This idea that you don't know what's really driving you, it's not part of the economic framework. So that's the first definition I care about. And I care about it, again, not because I think that you can't get interesting ideas without it, but I think that when it comes to policy, I want policy to be more comprehensive.
Right.
The second definition that I care about is the definition that where people don't understand what forces are driving their own decisions. So think about something like altruism, right? Classic standard economic theory has a challenge what to do with altruism, right? So economists, kind of neoclassical economists, ponder why do people go to vote, or why people would ever give a tip to somebody in a restaurant that they don't plan to go back to, right? Or how people play the trust game or the ultimatum game. So if you think about something like, social utility or altruism, normal people get it. Normal people know that they care about other people, that they're willing to give the money and so on. And economists don't include that in the model. That doesn't bother me. The second definition that I care about is where people don't understand what's driving their decisions, right? So if there's something that is influencing my decision and I don't understand it, that's a place where I could do mistakes, right? So again, from the perspective of policy and getting people to behave better, I care about those things. So for example, if teenagers don't understand it, if they start smoking, they will get addicted, and therefore they will change their behavior. That's something I want to understand. If people don't understand that once they get married, they'll start thinking differently about their significant other, but people don't understand how that feeling will happen, those are the things that influence me. If people don't understand that if the price goes up rather than go down, they start making some inferences about the product, those are the things that bother me. So I would say that the two definitions that I care about, and there are many definitions, the first one is about it's the basics of economics, complete transitive preferences. And the second one is about what are the forces that influence our decisions, but people don't realize that they're influencing our decisions.
Right. So I guess in terms of the second one, right? So how do we know what people really want, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I would say, for example, talk is cheap. And,
Yep.
There's a concept in economics called demonstrated preference. You know what people want based on their actions.
Yeah.
So if I say I want to lose a lot of weight and I eat fatty potato chips, I don't think that that's an example of, let's say, not me interacting with my preference. It just means that I have a greater preference from eating the fatty potato chips than I do of losing weight. And so while I might say I want to lose weight,
so
the fact that I'm
would
not
say,
acting consistent with that.
Yeah. So when you're saying this, you put a lot of weight on what people do, and not enough of what they say. And I just want you to recognize that it's a choice. It's a choice you've made to put more weight on what people do rather than what they say. So let's start with texting and driving. How many people do you think that survive accidents when they text and drive say this was a good decision?
Well, I'm not saying that people don't
No, just answer the question. What percentage of people do you think say this was a good decision?
Probably close to zero.
That's right, zero. And
Right.
and which of their selves do you prefer to believe? The person who is in hospital saying this was a stupid thing to do, I wish I didn't kill that person, or the person who texted and drove? Which one do you think is more informed?
Right. Well, the person in the hospital.
Yes.
Right.
So look, I feel you, right? I agree with you that it's so compelling to say, let's take what people do rather than what they say as an indication of what people really want. But one of the things we find is that your environment has a huge impact on how you're going to choose. So if I was going to come to your home every morning and bring a box of fresh donuts, and just before you wake up, I would put them nicely on the dining room table, odds are that you'll be tempted. Maybe not every day, but quite frequently. But also odds are that if I ask you if you want me to do that every day to you, you might say no.
Right.
So now the world is not always letting you say no, right? So when you talk about potato chips, you walk down the supermarket, somebody else designed that supermarket. Somebody else designed that supermarket without asking you, how do you want supermarkets to be designed? Now, and you know what? Somebody else designed chips with more knowledge than you about what's addictive. There's a very interesting human addiction to combination of salt and sugar. And lots of the things that are addictive, I get hungry as we speak. Lots of the things that are addictive are like that. So when you think about what people do, it's not perfectly free choice either. There's an engineer out there that is trying to develop something, a food engineer that is trying to design something that will tap your emotion in the strongest way and will get you to eat without thinking and without stopping. So, does that mean that that's really what you want to do? Does it mean you understand all the consequences? So I think that in many cases, people don't understand what choices that they're making, and the temptation in life is just way too high.
Okay.
Right. So because of that, I don't like to pick what people do as necessarily a better indication. I just came back from South America, and I was I talked at a conference on retirement, and I don't know if you know the mandatory retirement system in many countries in South America. So Chile was the first country that tried this, where they basically said, if you get a salary, 10% is going to mandatory savings, right? They did some other things, but and of course they started this system under a dictatorship, which create all kinds of emotional baggage with this pension, but they have this mandatory saving. In the US, for example, we don't have a mandatory saving. We have 401k, and people can participate if they want, but they don't have to. How well do you think how equipped are people to making a decision that say, I should or I shouldn't save for retirement? Let me ask you, how old are you?
31.
31. How much should you save right now for your retirement?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly.
What do you mean you don't know? Shouldn't you have exact preferences?
Well, I don't know, but look, to use the example of mandatory retirement, I think you could also say that also creates an incentive of people to be more careless with their money now, because they know in the future, because of this mandatory saving that they'll get in the future, that they can be more careless and increase their consumption now.
But by the way, there's lots of systems that you can create that create, as you know, unintended consequences. So that's of course the case. But the point I was trying to make is that in order to figure out how much money you need to retire, you first need to understand longevity, right? Because if I told you you're going to die at 65, that's very simple, right? You don't need to save. Don't worry about it. But if I tell you you're going to live somewhere between 65 and 100, you just don't know how long. Now you have a real question, right? You're going to need somewhere between, let's say you need $100,000 a year. If you're going to live between 65 and 100, you need somewhere between $0 and $3.5 million. Which one of those should you get, and very few people can save 3.5 million. So we need to save somewhere in the middle, but in between. But how much? So when we think that people are perfectly capable, it's kind of morally very easy, because you say, you know what, I don't know the answer, let me push it on everybody else to figure out for themselves. Every citizen should now figure out exactly how to allocate consumption between now and later. But you know what? Retirement, you get to retirement age once.
Right.
People get to age 65, and you don't want people to get to, oops, I made some mistakes. Because now, not only are they going to have a miserable life, and they'll finish their lives before they'll finish their money before they finish their life and maybe end in a poor house, but they also become a burden to society. So I think that we need kind of a more nuanced question, a more nuanced vision of what kind of decisions are people able to learn about. So I think, for example, you can probably learn if you like fish, if you like salmon more than sole or sole more than salmon. I trust you that you can do that, right? You need to try it a few times. From time to time, you might surprise yourself, right? I tried Brussels sprouts a few years ago. I was shocked. I thought I hated them when I was a kid. Turns out they're quite wonderful. But mostly we know we can learn from experience. But the big decisions in life, the decisions about finance, the decision about health, people are really in no capacity to learn. Diabetes. Let me just ask you about diabetes. Okay. What do you know about the consequences of diabetes? What happens to people with diabetes?
I mean, it affects your insulin levels. It can, cut short your life.
But
right?
No, but what happens? What kind of things happen to people in terms of quality of their lives?
Well, obviously it goes down.
But how? How does it go down?
I mean, it restricts what you can eat. You have to take certain medication. I think it affects you physically. I mean, I'm not an expert on this,
but you're making decisions about diabetes every time you eat chips. You recognize that, right? That every time. So here's the thing, and I'm not trying to make to push you to this, but I think it's a useful discussion. One of the downsides of diabetes is blindness. Did you know that?
Okay. No.
Did you know that many diabetics you have to amputate their limbs because of blood supply? Probably not either, right?
Right.
So diabetes, and by the way, people with diabetes often don't live shorter lives. They just live a more restricted life, and then of course blindness and amputation is part of the terrible progression of this disease. So when you have somebody who says, and I'm not just making it to you, I hear it from lots of economists, and people are saying, oh, if somebody is choosing to eat chips now, they're making the right decision. You know what? How could you possibly make the right decision when you don't understand the consequences on the other side? And even if you knew the statistics on what percentage of the people become blind and what percentage of the people become amputated, do you truly understand? Because I was in hospital for a long time. I understand things about amputation. For example, do you know that people that lose their big thumb, the big toe in their foot, limp more than people that lose their whole foot? So losing your big toe creates actually people limp more than if you lost your whole foot, because you lose balance. It's amazing how the big toe is important for balance. Now, look, there's lots of nuances like this.
Right.
And you say, oh, people make decisions and these are informed decisions. These are not informed decisions. And if you want to spend a month now in hospital and talk to people with diabetes and see how they live, and maybe get your own amputation so you understand how it is, and then you want to come back and say, I want to eat chips, I'll trust you then.
Okay.
But I think that this whole approach of saying people know what they're doing is said from the perspective of not really seeing consequences. I'm very, very much influenced by the amount of time I was in hospital. When people hear the news about accidents, we all mourn the dead. I also mourn the injured.
Right.
Because when you hear, here's a car accident and 2 people died and two people are in critical condition and one person is in non-critical condition, it sounds, oh, that's not that bad. But I know what their lives is going to be now. I don't know it fully, but I understand it a bit more. And without this knowledge, and this knowledge is true for every decision you make in life. It's true for texting and driving. It's true for obesity. It's true for diabetes. It's true for not saving. So I think that there's a lot of, to use the term you used before, there's a lot of hubris in saying, if people are choosing to smoke now, who are you to tell me that they don't know? Right. The nature of information, the nature of the information is so asymmetrical that without a true understanding of what's on the other side, I don't think people know what's on the other side. So I don't see how they could make an informed decision. Right. Anyway, that was a long speech on this. No
problem. But I think first, I'm not saying that people always make informed decisions, but I think people should be free to make bad decisions if they so choose. And
wait. Okay, so you said, if you said in the beginning, you said, if I choose to eat chips, who are you to tell me that this is not a good decision? And first of all, I would doubt if you truly understand the implications of your action, because again, as we discovered, you don't really understand diabetes. You thought of diabetes in some general terms. You didn't truly understand what it means, and most people don't. And even if you knew the statistics about different things, I don't think it would mean that you truly understood. Now, if there are things that people want to do with perfectly full knowledge that this is harmful, right? And let's take something without any knowledge gap and without an intertemporal choice. Let's say you basically said you want to cut yourself, right? You said, I want to feel pain. I felt pain before, I want to cut myself. And it's not about the now versus later. And you cut yourself a little bit to make sure that you understand what cutting is. And you say, I want a big cut. I have no complaints about that, right? I don't think that, by the way, saying that people from time to time make mistakes doesn't mean that people always make mistakes. And also, I'm perfectly happy with some people should make mistakes. It's fine to make mistakes. It's a way for us to learn. But there are some mistakes, the mistakes that you'll never get to recover from,
right?
Like health and not saving and so on, that I don't want people to get into.
Right.
But by the way, every year when I'm studying decision making, I'm becoming more and more paternalistic, because every year I'm realizing how difficult decisions are, how complex it is, how little I know. Just to understand something very narrow, I need to study it for such a long time to figure out what's right. There's no way that people have the time to study those things.
Right.
So out of respect to people's time and attention, and out of respect to people's, people are busy. Everybody has a life. People, the expression, the shadow economy, I think it's called, or the shadow labor market.
Right.
There's this idea that, we all have a job. I'm a university professor, people do different things. But in addition, society demands that we all become experts in medicine and in finance, and we all need to, learn how to figure out how to pay our bills and what bills to pay faster and slower and all kinds of things, and how to shop and how to read nutritional labels. And, we spend a lot of time on all of these tasks. The reality is that people have really no time to invest in these incredibly important decisions. Okay. So out of respect to people's busyness and complexity in life, I want to help people figure out what are some good basic choices.
Okay, but I mean, look, it's always compared to what? So for example, in your book, Predictably Irrational, one of the things you said is that people are manipulated by free, right? You gave two examples, one with the Amazon gift card, one with the chocolate, right? You said people are, manipulated by the word free, and they'll take a worse deal if it's free than they would have done in the absence of that. So to me, I think that's actually a great argument against government intervention, because if you'll have two politicians, one who's promising all this stuff that they say is free, and it's not really free, voters who are irrational, because it's not the market that's irrational, it's people, and I don't see why the same people would not be irrational, why they would be irrational in the market, but they would not be irrational in politics. Why? Yeah. How can we trust these people to vote? Because they could just be manipulated by people who are going to promise all this free stuff that maybe is a bad choice.
Yeah. So are you suggesting we cancel democracy? By the way, with this election, I'm not sure I'm against it.
I mean, I'm not a great fan of democracy, but the main problem that I have with democracy is that in the market, you alone suffer for the negative consequences of your action. So if I don't know anything about cars and I buy a car at random, I suffer if I get a bad car. But if I don't know anything about the politicians and I vote at random, other people are affected by what that politician does in office.
So first of all, I don't think that's true anymore. I think that in this day and age, we're all deeply connected, right? The connection as a society between people is tremendous. So if you buy a bad car and you have an accident, of course, other people suffer. But one of the things we find about poverty is that when people get into poverty, for example, or bad health or whatever it is, it costs everybody in society, right? So if you decide not to save for retirement, let's take health. If you decide to become an alcoholic, mm-hmm. It's obvious that your immediate family is going to suffer a lot as a consequence, right? Right. You're going to suffer. Your immediate family will suffer. But it's also true for the other people who are paying health insurance, and maybe for the people who are driving, and also it will be you will not have the same positive contribution on society, on the labor market, as you could have. There are very few cases that you can argue that there is no externalities to our actions. I think this idea, and by the way, it's a very powerful psychological force. So if you think about smoking, as long as we thought about smokers as killing themselves, nobody really minded. Mm-hmm. But the moment we invented the term secondhand smoke, now you were killing me, and now we were villainizing you, and now we were against it, and we took smokers and we villainized them and we made them go outside in the beginning and then not go to restaurants and all kinds of things like that. So we do have a bias toward things that we see the externalities more clearly, but I think that more and more things in society have externalities. For example, if you're poor and you don't have health insurance, the odds are that you would delay treatment. You would basically not pay out of pocket to a doctor until it's too late. Mm-hmm. I was in Chicago a few years ago, and this was a project in a very bad neighborhood in Chicago where lots of the kids had asthma. And a lot of the kids had asthma because they lived in houses, they had a lot of rats and cockroaches. So rats, cockroaches, and dust, that's a very bad recipe for asthma. So they started by living in very poor homes. As a consequence, they would get asthma. Now, the medication for asthma these days is really quite good. So if you take your medication regularly, life is reasonable. If you don't take your medication reasonably, you get to the emergency room, and on average, it's $12,000 a pop. Right. Right? So what happened is that when you say a kid with asthma, first of all, they have asthma because where they live and because of the neglect and because of rats and because of cockroaches, which is, not just their house. It's more than just their house. It's a social problem that, the rats are coming from their neighbors, the cockroaches are too. And then, of course, when they don't take the medication and they end up in hospital, they cost all taxpayers a lot of money because they are on Medicaid. So I think we all do rely on each other. Now your other question I think is more important, which is actually not more, but also important. which is the question of how do we create policies? Because if people are mistaken and irrational, who are we to say that politicians are going to set up the right policies?
And why would they not be irrational too?
That's right. But this is why I like science. So I think what we need to do is we need to have less hubris, and we need to study things. We need to try them out. So I think it is kind of shocking that, for example, the No Child Left Behind policy, we just implemented it without coming up with 5, 6 different versions and piloting them in different places for a few years before picking a policy. I think it's incredible to think that Obamacare was just rolled out rather than rolling out multiple pilots in different states and saying which one seems to be better 10 years from now. As an experimentalist, life shows me over and over and over how wrong I am. So there's something very, very humiliating and good, I think, in basically say, I think I understand how life is. Here's an experiment which I control. That's what, like God, right? I control my little universe that I'm creating here, and oops, I was wrong. And it's very nice to be wrong from time to time, actually, to realize how little we understand the world. So I don't want politicians to sit and reason about what are good and better policies, but I think we should be much more experimental about policies, and only in the same way that the FDA, right? The FDA requires that we have evidence, and you can argue about the FDA, and it's not always correct, and all kinds of things, but nevertheless, we want evidence, and I think we should also want evidence for policies.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, look, I'm not saying that externalities don't exist. Obviously, I think externalities exist, but in the case of negative externalities, they're mainly a result of not clearly defining property rights, because the whole point of a property right structure is to decide who benefits and who loses. So if I hit you with your car, yes, if as a result of me being drunk, yes, I've caused pain to you, the innocent person, but if I'm responsible, but if the law says if you damage someone else or hurt them, then I have to reimburse you for getting into a car, causing you pain or whatever it is.
Let me tell you that I think this is not a good perspective on life. If you injured somebody and you pay them some money as a consequence from that, I think everybody loses in this transaction. I think the person who it's not neutral, right? The person who paid the money, or the insurance company who paid the money, are worse off, and the person who lost the use of their legs or whatever it is, money doesn't really compensate for that. I'm not saying it doesn't help at all. Of course, if you're injured and you have money, you can live a better life in all kinds of ways. But this idea that it just everybody is neutral at the end because of that is just not true. I think that the amount of negative externalities on society is actually very high. Mm-hmm. I'll give you another example for a negative externality that people don't think about. What do you think is the percentage of private police force in Africa?
Private police force in Africa?
Yeah, so in the US, we have some very wealthy people that walk around with bodyguards. Mm-hmm. Right, but it's a tiny proportion compared to the police force.
True.
What do you think it's in Africa?
I don't know, probably low, not that high.
So in Africa, private police in some countries is more than 70%. Mm-hmm. More than 70%, right? It's huge. It's
pretty
huge. Good. No, it's not good. Private. It means that the poor have no defense, and it's mean that the wealthy are buying protection. Right? Now, what happens when you have a non-stable economic system is that people become desperate.
Right.
And when people become desperate, everybody loses. I told you I just came back from South America. I spent one day in Mexico, one in Colombia, one in Peru, one in Chile. It was a hectic trip. But when I landed in Mexico, they gave me a bodyguard, right? That was just with me all the time. Now, that's just a terrible way to live. It's a terrible way to live. But when you live in a country that a lot of people are desperate, crime is rampant, and people have to spend lots of money to get protected. Right? Now, what would happen if we don't have those desperate people? Right? The fact that we have an economy that is not understanding that people who are desperate have nothing to lose and are willing to do all kinds of things to basically survive, even if it creates tremendous damage for society. It's just a shame.
Okay, no, I agree with that, but I'm just saying, right? I think it's important to compare, comparables. So I think one major difference between the market and government is that in the market there's competition, right? So I can't unsubscribe from the FBI if I'm not satisfied with their services. And as I think we have a lot of recent evidence recently, police are quite trigger happy. They often get away with it. Yep. And I think that's very, very problematic. Right? I think if you had for-profit police, they would go bankrupt if they were overly aggressive, unlike the public police who are not really held accountable.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I don't know. And I think it also depends on the area, right? So we in the US we recently had a vote against private prisons. Right, and I'm actually quite happy with that vote. I think that private prisons create terrible incentives to keep people in prison. So I think we'll see, right? Well, what will happen afterward?
Right.
But well, I think first of all, I just want to tell you that you do have a choice even with governments. As you probably know, the US is not the only country around. The other country around, you believe in revealed preferences. I haven't seen you submitting applications to Sweden yet, or maybe you have. But so first of all, we do have a choice. I think we do have some choice. It's not easy, it's not, and so on. But we do have a choice. But I think the question of what services are better handled by a government, and what services are better handled by competition is a really interesting one. And one of my favorite taxes is actually a tax in Colombia. And I forgot the name of the tax in Spanish, but it's a payroll tax that companies have to pay. I think it's around 5%. But they have to pay it to a local charity, and the local charities compete for it. And it's not all charities can apply for it, but some charities apply. And what you have there is you have a mandatory tax that goes to a local enterprise, but the government stood out of the business and he said, let's private non-for-profit compete to what they're going to do with it. And I kind of like that that approach. Now, there are some things like local charities that don't necessarily need a lot of economies of scale. There are some things like healthcare, NIH, basic research, NASA, that depend on a tremendous amount of large economies and economies of scale. So those will be different. So I think it's worthwhile to think about systematically about what are the kind of things we think the government would be better at, and what are the kind of things that we think private industry would be better. And what are the kind of things that we think government will be better at regulating, but then handing it off to private industry?
Right. Okay. So a few things. First of all, when I define private, I mean privately funded and privately owned. So-called private prisons are government contracting out, so I don't really consider that private because the consumer itself is not. It's not privately funded. It's through a government contract.
No. The private prisons are privately owned and privately run, and they're their own economic system.
Who funds them? Who are the customers?
I don't know how you call who you call customers. The prisoners or the customers?
How do they get their money?
So the way they get their money is they get it from the government. The government is paying per day, right? But the government there's government prisons, and if you can run a prison more efficiently, go for it.
Okay.
Right. So they are competing. They're competing with the government prisons and competing with each other. For Texas, for example, there's lots of those, right? So they're competing with each other on efficiency, and they have standards and all kinds of things like that. But let's not go into the prison discussion. Are there things? So I think that the government. First of all, I love economies of scale. I think it's one of the most important forces. I think it's one of the reasons for the strength of the U.S. is the economies of scale. I love that the government is investing in deep R&D and infrastructure. Right? These are no more the days where a private person can fund, a train from California to the East Coast. Now it's just too expensive. So the scale is not always possible. Even if you look at the big companies out there, they have a really hard time funding true large infrastructure projects. It's very easy to do software companies, but when you need deep infrastructure or when you need 20 years of research into biology to produce something, that's just not something that private industry is set up for. I mean, look at the failure that we had with VCs that were funding solar energy. We had, when Obama was first elected, we had lots of excitement about solar energy. A lot of VCs jump on it. They had funds, but the VCs are not designed for something that needs 20 years of investment. They want returns in at most 10 years.
Right.
The time horizon for true development in energy is not in 10 years, or true development in biology. So my view is that private industry is really good for the last mile, maybe the last 5 miles, but it's not really suited for the basic development.
Okay.
I feel I've talked for almost an hour and didn't let you talk, so now it's your turn.
Thank you. Yeah. So I mean, okay. So I think a few things. I mean, first of all, I think that look, I think the government creates the biggest externalities of all, right? War, huge externalities. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I can't think of probably a greater externality than that. Holocaust. So the government itself, I think, creates the biggest externalities. I think in many ways, what is even considered an externality is extremely subjective, right? The example I like to give is, to me, a negative externality is a woman who's naked, and a positive externality is an attractive woman who's naked. So I think that women who are attractive.
Have you been listening to Trump for too long? Is that what's going on?
No. All men are pigs. So I mean, it's extremely subjective. What is considered an externality in many ways, or not, right? I mean,
no. Just because you can come up with examples that are subjective doesn't mean that all externalities are subjective. I agree with you that not all externalities are clear if they are externalities, if they're negative, or if they're positive. But there's lots of things that are clear.
Right. But like, for example, there are certain people who say, national defense is a public good. Not if you're a pacifist to that, right? Because if you're a pacifist, let's say, you don't want there to be any war or any military.
Yeah.
So
But even if you're a pacifist, you don't. I mean, you don't want war. Like you might and and one way not to get war is to have some investment in defense. I mean, that's kind of clear. So because we're running out of time, I'll give you the chance for the last word. So what do you think we've learned in this hour?
I mean, I think we've learned that people are imperfect, and I guess they don't have access to perfect information. I mean, one of the things that I would say is that that's true, but I think that competition allows the corrective, or at least moving in that direction, to do it, right? I mean, if there's a car that's unsafe, a competitor has a strong incentive to find out information to make it where he can to find out, to make a safer car, or to reveal that his competitor's car is not as safe. And I think that sometimes, that this charge of people are rationality, I think that should be also looked at in not just in the marketplace, but in government, because if people are irrational and can't make decisions on something as simple as deciding what potato chips to eat, I don't see how they can make a decision as who to vote to make those decisions for them.
Yeah. So I decided to give you the last word, so I'm not going to come back, but I will ask you one question.
Yeah.
If you think about the Volkswagen scandal, do you think this scandal could have solved by another company that would have revealed that and would have tried to fix that market? So you basically said if somebody sells an unsafe car, another company would come and this other company would reveal it and so on. Do you think the Volkswagen scandal could have been discovered by another company, and which company do you think would have done it?
Well, I certainly don't know which company would do it, but I think if there's an incentive, I think eventually there's an incentive to try to.
By the way, it's been for a long time. This thing has been going on for a long time. So the fact that nobody found it, but so you believe that if the government would have laid off, Toyota would have discovered it at some point with its investigative reporting, and they would have advertised it, and they would have forced Volkswagen to change. And if you believe that, I don't think you know either Toyota or Volkswagen or any other car company for that matter.
Okay.
Anyway, lovely to have this discussion. It would have been much nicer to have it in person over beer,
all right,
rather than over distance. But thanks for indulging me, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And looking forward to our next time.
Yep, sounds good. Looking forward as well. Take care.
Take care.
Any books you want to let people know about, or website or something?
If people want to check my website, it's Ariely, DANARIELY.com. That will be great.
All right. Lovely to have you on. Take care.
A pleasure. Take care.